So recently, a few people shared a clip with me featuring Milo Yiannopoulos on what I think was Tim Pool's podcast. And if you don't know, Milo Yiannopoulos is ethnically Jewish in some way, but a recent convert to Catholicism. And I don't really know if it's stuck with him or not, or anything more about him than that. But he was on this podcast and claiming in this clip that Judaism is false. And so a few people shared that with me, and one person who seemed a little bit alarmed when they asked me this question because of the apparent implications of it, they said, how can Christianity be true if Judaism is false? Because of course, as Christians, we would say that modern day Judaism, if you take it as a whole, isn't a true religion. But that might not sit right with some people who would say that, well, isn't Christianity contingent upon Judaism? You might be thinking that Judaism is a cause that eventually led to Christianity. And in a causal sequence, if you remove an earlier cause, you don't get later strands of that sequence, which Christianity would be in this case. Like, for example, if a chandelier is like hanging from a chain, and if you remove a link in that chain, everything after that link, including the chandelier, will be lost. Another analogy that might hit closer to home for some Christians is the way that so many of us affirm the Bible as authoritative and inerrant, but then deny that the church is similarly authoritative and inerrant. This is one of the big contentions of Protestantism against Catholicism. But the problem that some people, myself included as a Catholic, see with that is that the chain that includes the Bible as we know it as one of its links has the church as an earlier link in that sequence. The Bible is an effect of the church. The church, by the authority inspired in her through Christ and the Holy Spirit, wrote the New Testament and then decided which books were part of that canon. The Bible didn't do that itself. It didn't write itself or provide an index of books. The Holy Spirit, through the church, did that. And an effect can't be greater than its cause. An effect can't have something that its cause didn't give it. So if you deny that the church can possess infallible authority, then you're simultaneously claiming that the church couldn't have given us the Bible, which it did. And some of you might be thinking that a similar relationship exists between Judaism and Christianity as a causal relationship. If you deny Judaism, haven't you cut off the branch that you're sitting on? To explain how to make sense of this, it'll be helpful to offer a bit of a history lesson, so just bear with me here. The history of salvation, of which Christianity claims to offer the last step in that sequence, begins in the Old Testament with the Old Covenant, with Noah and Abraham, and eventually the Israelites through the covenant with Moses and the law. And eventually, the people in that covenant enter into the promised land that was promised to the descendants of Abraham, and they appoint a lineage of kings and establish a temple in Jerusalem. Also, further revelation and prophecy told them that they should look forward to the coming of the Messiah, or the Anointed One, who would establish an everlasting kingdom. Now, it's really important to note what is intrinsic to that religion. The temple is where God dwelled among them and where sacrifices were offered according to the law that he himself commanded. Jerusalem is also where the seat of Moses and his priestly and teaching authority resided. And Christianity affirms all of that as true and valid. And then Jesus appears on the scene, who claimed to be from heaven. He refers to God as his Father, whom he is one with. At several points, he refers to himself using God's name, I am, which Jews at that time wouldn't even utter to refer to God for fear of blaspheming. He performs miracles. He is brutally crucified by the Romans. And then he's supposedly brought back to life and spends time affirming and commissioning his disciples to carry on his work before himself ascending back to heaven. And then, not long after those historical events, there is a revolt against Roman occupation in Judea, which is brutally crushed by Rome, who then proceed to level Jerusalem and the temple along with it. Now, remember, the temple is where God dwelled. It's an intrinsic part of that covenant. It's what gave the Jews their identity in relation to God as his chosen people. The fact of his presence there is a massive part of what set them apart from the rest of the world. It's also essential to the function of the sacerdotal priesthood, which was like an intermediary for the people and the means by which sins could be atoned for. But without the temple, there is no more functioning priesthood and no more presence of God among the people. There's no way for them to satisfy the demands of the covenant they had with God. So you could argue that the religion as it was practiced by the ancient Israelites, according to that covenant, it ended at that point, or it at least became vacant. And we are now 2,000 years later, and it hasn't been restored. It's a long period of time to tolerate God's vacancy from his people. And in the wake of the end of the practice of that ancient faith, two rival successors appear on the scene. Both of them claim that there is more to the story of God and humanity to be told. One of them was Christianity, which claimed that Jesus was the Messiah that had been waited for, and that all revelation and all their history had been fulfilled in him. The other apparent successor appeared in Talmudic or Rabbinic Judaism, which is what we commonly refer to simply as Judaism today. But it's important to appreciate that this is a religion that is established as a successor to ancient Judaism and not a seamless continuation. And don't get me wrong here, the people who practice what we would call modern day Judaism or just Judaism are descendants, so they're still Jews, but their beliefs are something that are a little bit altered. Because again, the central piece, or the central practice of that faith in temple worship ended after its destruction. And further, they added a new teaching tradition in the Talmud. The Talmud has become for them a central source for theology and law, according to Jewish scholar Jacob Neusner. And the Talmud doesn't appear as a formally compiled text until the 5th century at the earliest, making it something new, at least chronologically. And although some would argue that the text of the Talmud is simply a continuation of the ancient oral tradition, there's certainly things in it that are unfamiliar to that tradition. And we know this because in one of the first major controversies regarding the Talmud, a Jewish convert to Christianity named Nicholas Donin had translated in the 13th century, and then he spread the claim that it contained blasphemous statements about Jesus and the Blessed Virgin Mary, which it arguably does. When this eventually reached the attention of Pope Gregory IX, he expressed surprise that the Jews relied on anything other than the Old Testament. That's what Christians at the time believed about the Jews and what they had in common. So that should give us an idea of how hidden or novel the Talmud was in the era after Christ's death. It took some 7 centuries to get noticed by the dominant Christian culture that the Jewish diaspora was living among. In what eventually became a public inquiry into the Talmud, in what became known as the Disputation of Paris, it was revealed that there were quite a few passages in the Talmud that surprised the Catholic authorities, the religious and theological authorities, because of how foreign they appeared in contrast to teachings on the same subject in the Old Testament. In other words, they were surprised to learn what Jews living among them for centuries actually believed, in contrast to what they thought they held in common as believers in the Bible. And lastly, of course, Christians take serious exception to the explicit denial of Christ as the Messiah in Rabbinic Judaism, which is another doctrine that is in addition to ancient Judaism, because the Old Covenant would not have had anything to say about Jesus being the Messiah since he hadn't come yet. So when Christians say that Judaism isn't a true religion or that it lacks the fullness of truth, they aren't referring to the ancient faith of the Old Covenant. They're referring to Rabbinic Judaism as a system that claims to be a natural successor of ancient Judaism. Even though it doesn't have any temple worship or sacrifices, doesn't have a sacerdotal priesthood, a new covenant to replace the apparently vacant old one, and a new textual set of teachings, which at first glance seems to be in contrast to the biblical scriptures in multiple areas. St. Thomas Aquinas says the Old Covenant was good and true, but that it was incomplete because it could not help man attain to eternal happiness, only a kind of temporal happiness, and because it lacked the fullness of revelation. And then the fact that it was incomplete is something that both Christianity and modern Judaism would agree with, since they both subsequently added something to it. So if both modern-day Jews and Christians can gladly affirm the true history and teachings of the people of God in the Old Testament, then the important concern is deciding which of the claimed successors to that ancient faith is the legitimate one. And naturally, Jesus as the Messiah has to be the point of interest in that inquiry. I'd start by pointing out the almost incomprehensible number of cross-references between the Old Testament and the New Testament that Christians believe is the fulfillment of the Old. Many of those cross-references being predictions or prophecies about the Messiah, which seem to correlate or point to Jesus and his life and teachings. This visualization, which was made famous by Jordan Peterson in his lectures on the Bible, offers a glimpse of how rich those relationships are and how impossible it would be to conspire to fabricate this level of integration, especially when you consider that the people that wrote the New Testament were not scholars or even well educated at all, which you'd have to be to pull off this degree of conspiracy. There's also something to be said about the specific chronology of events that relate to the coming of the Messiah in the Old Testament scriptures. The book of Daniel in chapter 9 gives a very specific timeline about what to expect from the Messiah. According to scholars, he claimed that the Messiah would come 483 years after the rebuilding of the temple, which clocks in right around 33 AD, which is the year that Jesus triumphantly entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Even if you disregard that though, or if you come up with a different calculations, you dispute the calculations coming to that particular date, you still have to contend with the fact that according to Daniel and the timeline that he gives, the Messiah would have to have come by now, but modern day Jews claim to still be waiting for the Messiah. Furthermore, there were characteristics about the Messiah that they were supposed to look for to know, to identify him. For example, he was supposed to descend from the tribe of Judah, but all the records of who comes from what tribe are entirely lost to history by now. In Jesus' time, that was still known, but since the fall of Jerusalem, there's no longer any way to verify that. Daniel also tells us that the temple would be destroyed after the coming of the Messiah. We see that in verse 26. While history records and the living artifacts show that the temple was destroyed by Titus in 70 AD, only decades after the events concerning the life of the Messiah. According to Daniel, the Messiah had to have come before those events took place. Now, I would say that's pretty remarkable and certainly not something that even the most sophisticated conspirators, which the followers of Jesus were not, could have orchestrated. Can I ask you to stick around for one extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year. And if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.